Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of learning the basics of R for Bio 170. I'm the Bio 170 instructor, Israel del Toro, and today we're going to be talking about basically going through a quick recap of what we've done so far. We're going to talk a little bit about working directories, dealing and importing data in a couple different ways. I'll show you a couple new tricks there, and dealing and importing libraries. And just remember that libraries are a set of functions that have been compiled. You'll also hear me use the word packages and libraries interchangeably. Just keep note that when I'm talking about one, I'm referring to the same thing. But most of the time today, we're going to spend it talking about tidy data. And what is tidy data? And what does tidy data actually mean? Tidy and tidyr are a couple of packages that we're going to be working heavily with, which will allow us to manage our data in an effective way and sort of try to get our data in the most clear and straightforward way for get into a format that's simple and clear to analyze. One of the things I strongly recommend is that you visit this website here, which can be accessed through the RStudio platform. But if you just do a quick Google search for data wrangling with dplyr and tidyr, you're going to come across this cheat sheet. And this cheat sheet, I have it printed in my office as a giant poster because these are functions and instructions on how to do some of the most basic things with tidy and dplyr. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with today's activity. So I'm just going to open up my RStudio. And you'll notice one of the things that I've done before anything else is I've made a folder for today's exercises. I'm calling it week 1 because it's the week of the term that I'm working in. And basically this folder is going to serve as my working directory. So we can navigate to that in just a second. All right, I'm going to cheat a little bit here and have some pre-written code. But for the most part, we're going to be working through a few examples here. So first step in dealing with any new set of code, just remember that this is our text editing window, this is our console, our environment window, and then our packages, helps, and plotting window. One thing you'll notice in a bit of my code is that it is preceded by this hashtag, and then everything else gets grayed out behind it. This hashtag is how I annotate code. This means that these are little notes that I leave to myself to remind me what I'm doing in the code in the subsequent lines. So here, for example, I have a hashtag annotation that says set my working directory. To do that, now I can go ahead and go to session, set working directory, choose directory. It's going to pop open this navigation box here, and all I'm going to do is navigate to my desktop and then to week 1 where I want my working directory to be. I'll click open, and the line of code that corresponds to setting that working directory is now set here. I'm going to go ahead and copy that and paste it back into my text editor just so I have it in case anything happens. All right, load data. So previously we read in our data by using this read CSV function. And we're going to go ahead and do that here. And we're going to make a new data object. And if you remember correctly, the way we make objects is by using the less than minus arrow sign. And we're going to call this new object data _1. And we're going to use the function read.csv. And we're going to look back in our directory where I've saved this data set. Let's see if I can minimize here. Let's take a look in that directory. The name of the file that I'm going to try and download is this testdata.csv. Now remember that R is case sensitive, so it's important that we type everything out as the file is named. So we'll call it testdata.csv, and that should load up our first object, data1. We can look at what data1 looks like just by simply clicking on it, and it opens up a spreadsheet. And it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns titled observation, group, response 1, response 2, and response 3. and a total of 10 different observations of 5 different variables. Some are categorical and some are numeric. Cool. Let me just show you a quick little hack in case you forget how to load data with read CSV. You can do this by simply going to File, Import Dataset from CSV. It's going to install some dependent packages. Give it a second here. And what this is doing is basically installing any packages that are required to run this bit of this widget. Now, this is a really simple way of importing a CSV file. All I have to do is browse, select the CSV file I want to import, in this case testdata.csv, click Open. And what's really cool about doing it this way is we're going to see what our data is actually going to look like in its final form. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger or zoom out. We can see that essentially what we're going to have are our different columns. So it's giving us a preview of what our data is actually going to end up looking. We can call this anything. We can call this data_1, but just for explanation purposes, we'll call it test data. And click Import. And now we've created a second object, which is identical to our first object of 10 observations and 5 variables. If we wanted to save the line of code that did that, we'll see that it's also a read CSV function, but it's nested within a different package called readr or reader. All right, sorry about that, folks. I keep getting rudely interrupted by my email here, so hopefully I've taken care of that. We were basically working with loading in a couple of libraries, the dplyr library and the tidyr library. So now that we've loaded and installed our libraries, all we have to do is run the library function for each one of them, and that'll make sure that we have access to the functions nested within these two packages. The first function we're going to be looking at is called the gather function. Tidy data likes to be handled in 2 different ways, either in a long format or a wide format. Typically, when we enter data into spreadsheets, most people like to enter their data as a wide format, which tidy data can handle, but there are some advantages to having our data in a long format. So we're going to go through what those 2 formats are and how to convert from one format to the other using the gather function. We'll go ahead and ask R first to give us some information about gather using the help or the question mark gather, which tells us that gather is a function that takes multiple columns and collapses into key value pairs, duplicating all columns as needed. So let's take a look real quick at our first data set, which is data_1. And what we see here is that we have essentially 10 observations. These are just the first 6 of these different response variables. This is your standard traditional long format where each observation, observations 1 through 10, have all of the different values associated to it. This is going to look pretty familiar to the way that you may handle your data. But we might also need to use the gather function now to convert from this wide format to a long format. The way we do this is we use the gather function, we denote our data set, we type in our response variable, what we want our column to be, and the value associated with that response. Then we simply list the 3 different responses here, 1, 2, and 3, response 1, 2, and 3, and that should allow us to create a data set now in the long format. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Now we've gone from wide to long, and now we see that instead of having these 5 columns, now we just have observation, group, the response 1, 2, and 3, and then the value associated with those responses. So we haven't changed anything of the data, any of the data. We've just restructured it in a way that might be easier for R to handle. All right. Let's go ahead and go back here. So that's the gather function. If you ever need to go from wide to long, you would use the gather function to do that. Another thing you're probably going to want to do is you're going to want to summarize your data. And sometimes you want to summarize by particular study groups. For example, the red group versus the blue group. We would want to see what the differences are in these two different groups. To do that, we're going to use 2 functions, the summarize function and the group by function. So let's go ahead and do our first summary. What we're going to do here is use the summarize function on the data object data_1, and let's say we want to calculate a column called mean, which is equal to the mean of response 1. Let's see what that looks like. Now when we do that summary 1, we can click on that and it gives us the mean of that entire first column. But it doesn't tell us anything about the mean per group. In order to do that, we're going to have to use the group by function first. So we have to use, we're going to go ahead and create a new data object here called data_1_grouped using the group by function on the data object data_1, and we want to group things based on the column called group, red versus blue. It doesn't look like a very different data set, but now there's a little bit additional information in here telling it that we want to treat red group versus blue group a little bit different. So we're going to make this second summary using essentially the same code that we used before, but just on our new data object. And if we look at summary 2, now we have the means for the blue group and the means for that red group. This is how you would use the group by function to essentially create different summaries for different groups. And of course, you don't have to do one at a time. You can do multiple summary data bits. So in this case, we want to do the mean and the standard deviation. And we can add this to our summary 2. And we see that our summary 2 now contains not only the mean, but also the standard deviation for each one of these variables. Taking this information now, we can go ahead and run lines of code in ggplot, for example. And remember to load in ggplot first before you run any code for it. There it is. And we're going to go ahead and create our first plot. And so this is just a simple point plot with error bars. And of course, I'll post this code up, but there are different ways of modifying this graph so that it ends up looking a little bit prettier and a little bit more easy to digest. And you'll have access to this bit of code so you can tinker with this on your own time. But just to show you what the final graph might end up looking like, it's essentially a graph of means with standard error bars. You can even annotate, you can change titles, you can change colors. All of these bits of code are nested within the annotations of lines 34 to 43. So feel free to play around with that. Okay, that's all I've got for today, and we'll see you next time on our upcoming